The morning dew still clung to the sparse grass as Clara Evans dragged her heavy trunk across the threshold. Her mother's final words ringing in her ears like the church bell that had once called her to Sunday worship. No woman is worthy of the Evans name if she cannot fulfill her God-given duty to bear children. The door had slammed with such finality that Clara had felt the vibration in her bones, a physical manifestation of the severance between mother and daughter. Wyoming Territory, 1875. The town of Willowcreek was awakening to another day, unaware that one of its daughters had been cast out before sunrise, disowned for a failure of her womb after 5 years of marriage to a man now buried 6 feet under following a mining accident. At 26, Clara was considered by many to be in the twilight of her prime years, and her mother, Vivian Evans, had made it abundantly clear that a childless widow had no place in her home. "Need some help with that, madam?" The voice startled Clara from her thoughts, causing her to release the trunk. It landed with a thud in the dirt. She looked up to see a tall man on horseback, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but even through the layer of dirt she could tell they were well made. The horse beneath him was a magnificent chestnut stallion that seemed almost too grand for the modest main street of Willowcreek. "I'm quite all right, thank you," Clara replied, brushing away a tear before it could fall. Pride was the only possession her mother hadn't managed to strip from her. The man dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. He approached slowly, as if giving her time to object further. "I'm Jake Anderson," he said, removing his hat to reveal a shock of dark hair and eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. "Just rode in from Colorado, looking to settle some business with the bank here." Clara straightened her back, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "Clara Evans. And truly, Mr. Anderson, I require no assistance." Jake glanced at the trunk, then back at the closed door behind her. The Evans house was one of the finest in Willowcreek, a testament to the success of Clara's late father in the cattle business. The contrast between the elegant home and Clara standing forlornly on the street with her single trunk was stark. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Evans, but it appears you might need somewhere to go before you need help with that trunk." His voice was gentle, lacking the pity she dreaded but carrying a genuine concern that made her throat tighten. "It's Miss Evans now," she corrected automatically. "My husband died last winter." Jake nodded solemnly. "My condolences. If you don't mind my asking, where are you heading?" Clara looked down the dusty street, reality settling on her shoulders like a leaden shawl. She had some money saved, but not enough to secure proper lodging for more than a week or two. Her husband's mining shares had been sold to pay his debts, and her mother had made it clear that not a cent of the Evans fortune would follow Clara out the door. "I haven't quite decided," she admitted finally. Jake looked at her thoughtfully. "I'm staying at the boarding house down the way. Mrs. Winters runs a respectable establishment. I could walk you there, make sure you get a room." Clara hesitated, weighing her limited options. Her pride warred with practicality as the morning sun climbed higher, promising a scorching day ahead. "I would be grateful for that," she conceded. Jake lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing, securing it to his horse. He offered Clara his arm with a courteous nod, and they began the walk toward the boarding house in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Mrs. Winters, a plump widow with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took one look at Clara's pale face and insisted on feeding her before discussing lodging arrangements. Soon, Clara found herself at a wooden table with a bowl of hearty stew before her, Jake seated across from her with a cup of coffee. "Mrs. Winters makes the best elk stew this side of the Rockies," Jake commented, watching as Clara took a tentative spoonful. "I stop here whenever business brings me through Willowcreek." "What business is that, Mr. Anderson?" Clara asked, grateful for the distraction from her troubles. "I run cattle," he replied. "Got a spread about 2 days' ride from here. Looking to expand, which is why I'm meeting with your bank. Clara nodded, remembering that her father had often spoken of the ranchers to the north who were building empires on the backs of longhorns. My father was in cattle as well, before he passed. Thomas Evans, Jake said, recognition dawning on his face. I met him once at a livestock auction in Cheyenne. Fine man, respected by all. Clara felt a pang of grief. Her father had been gone for 3 years now, but the loss still felt fresh. He would never have allowed her mother to treat her so callously. Yes, he was. Mrs. Winters approached their table, wiping her hands on her apron. Now then, dear, about your room. I'm afraid I've only got the small one at the back of the house available. It's not much, but it's clean. That would be perfect, thank you, Clara said, reaching for her reticule to count out the necessary coins. Jake cleared his throat. Mrs. Winters, please put Miss Evans in the front room with the view of the mountains. I'll take the back room. Clara's head snapped up. Mr. Anderson, that's not necessary. It's no trouble, he insisted. I'll be out most days anyway, looking at land. You'll make better use of the sunlight than I will. Before Clara could protest further, Mrs. Winters beamed with approval. That's settled then. Mr. Anderson, you are a true gentleman. Miss Evans, I'll have your trunk brought up right away. As Mrs. Winters bustled off, Clara turned to Jake with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Why would you do that for a stranger, Mr. Anderson? Jake sipped his coffee, considering his words carefully. My mother was widowed young, with me and my 2 sisters to raise. People showed her kindness when she needed it most. I believe in passing that forward when I can. There was something in his steady gaze that made Clara believe him, made her feel that his generosity came without expectation of return. It was a novel feeling after the conditional nature of her mother's love. Thank you, she said simply. The conversation turned to lighter topics as they finished their meal. Clara learned that Jake had built his ranch from nothing, starting with a small herd and gradually expanding over the last 8 years. At 31, he had established himself as a respectable rancher with a reputation for fair dealing and hard work. As they parted ways, Jake to his meeting at the bank, Clara to settle into her new room, she felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Perhaps Willowcreek still held possibilities for her, even without the support of her family name. The front room at Mrs. Winters' boarding house was indeed lovely, with a large window that framed the distant mountains. Clara unpacked her modest belongings, arranging them carefully in the dresser and wardrobe provided. The bed was comfortable, the linens fresh and crisp. It was a far cry from her room at the Evans house, with its fine furnishings and silk curtains, but there was a peace here that had been absent from her childhood home for years. After washing up and changing into a clean dress, Clara sat at the small writing desk by the window and took stock of her situation. She had enough money to pay for lodging and food for perhaps a month, if she was frugal. After that, she would need to find employment. The prospect was daunting. Clara had been raised to be a lady, educated in literature and music but with few practical skills that would translate to paid work. She could sew reasonably well, but not with the proficiency of a professional seamstress. Her penmanship was excellent, but she had no experience with bookkeeping or business correspondence. A knock at her door interrupted her worrying. Mrs. Winters stood there with a tray of tea and biscuits. "Thought you might like a little refreshment, dear," she said, setting the tray on the desk. "And I wanted to ask if you've given any thought to what you'll be doing here in Willowcreek." Clara sighed. "I'm afraid I haven't had much time to plan. My departure from my mother's house was rather sudden." Mrs. Winters clucked sympathetically. "Small towns have big ears, my dear. I've heard whispers about Vivian Evans and her expectations." She patted Clara's hand. "Not everyone shares her views, you know." Clara felt tears threatening again, but blinked them back. "Thank you for saying so. I mention it because I might have an opportunity for you." Mrs. Winters continued. I'm not as young as I once was, and running this place takes more energy each year. I could use some help with the cleaning, cooking, and general management. The pay wouldn't be much, but it would include your room and board. Relief washed over Clara. Mrs. Winters, that would be wonderful. I'm not experienced as a housekeeper, but I'm willing to learn. That's all I ask, the older woman said with a smile. We can start tomorrow if that suits you. After Mrs. Winters left, Clara sipped her tea and watched as the afternoon sun gilded the mountains with golden light. For the first time since receiving news of her husband's death, she felt the weight on her shoulders lighten slightly. She had a roof over her head and the promise of work. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but perhaps it could be enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new routines and responsibilities. Clara learned to cook for the boarding house residents, to manage the laundry schedules, and to balance the account books. Mrs. Winters proved to be a patient teacher and a kind employer, never scolding when Clara made mistakes, but gently showing her how to improve. Jake Anderson remained at the boarding house longer than he had initially planned, his business with the bank apparently requiring extended negotiations. Clara saw him at breakfast and dinner each day, their conversations growing more comfortable and wide-ranging. She found herself looking forward to their exchanges, appreciating his insight and the way he treated her with respect rather than pity. One evening, as Clara was clearing the dinner dishes, Jake lingered at the table while the other boarders dispersed to their rooms or to the saloon for evening entertainment. You seem to be settling in well, he observed as she stacked the plates. Clara smiled, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Mrs. Winters has been very patient. I'm afraid I wasn't raised to be particularly useful in a practical sense. On the contrary, Jake said, I've noticed you have a gift for making people feel at ease. The Simmons boy doesn't stutter nearly as badly when you're the one serving his breakfast. Clara hadn't realized anyone had noticed her efforts with young Timothy Simmons, a traveling salesman's son who struggled with a pronounced stammer. He just needs someone to listen patiently. Jake nodded. That's a rare quality, you know. Patience. Especially in these parts where everyone's in such a hurry to stake their claim or make their fortune. Clara sat down across from him, her work momentarily forgotten. Is that what brought you here? The pursuit of fortune? Jake considered the question. Partly, I suppose. I wanted land of my own, something that couldn't be taken away by circumstance or another man's decision. But mostly, I wanted to build something lasting. He looked at her directly. What about you, Clara? What do you want now that you're making your own way? The question caught her off guard. For so long, her desires had been subordinate to her mother's expectations, then to her husband's needs. I'm not sure, she admitted. Security, I suppose. A place where I belong. Jake's expression softened. Those are worthy aims. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Winters calling for Clara's help with a delivery of supplies for the kitchen. As Clara excused herself, she felt Jake's eyes following her, and for the first time since arriving at the boarding house, she was acutely aware of her worn dress and work-roughened hands. The following Sunday, Clara found herself walking to church alone. Mrs. Winters had taken ill with a summer cold and had insisted that Clara go without her, saying, "The Lord won't mind my absence this once, but you need to show your face, my dear. People forget too quickly in small towns." Clara understood the wisdom in this. Her mother would be at the service, of course, sitting in the Evans family pew at the front of the church. Clara had no intention of trying to join her there, but she couldn't avoid the public gathering indefinitely if she was to make a life in Willowcreek. She chose a seat near the back, nodding politely to acquaintances who seemed uncertain how to react to her reduced circumstances. Some offered kind smiles, others quickly averted their eyes. Clara kept her head high, focusing on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church, rather than on the elegant bonnet she could just see from her position, her mother's, trimmed with silk flowers that Clara herself had arranged. Just as the service was about to begin, Jake slipped into the pew beside her. Clara glanced at him in surprise. He was dressed in his best, his hair neatly combed, hat held respectfully in his hands. "I didn't know you attended this church," she whispered. "I don't, usually," he replied quietly. "But Mrs. Winters mentioned you'd be here alone today." Before Clara could respond, the minister began the opening prayer, and the congregation rose to its feet. Throughout the service, Clara was intensely aware of Jake's solid presence beside her, a buffer between herself and the curious or judgmental glances cast her way. As the final hymn concluded and people began to file out, Clara steeled herself for the inevitable encounter with her mother. Vivian Evans stood in the churchyard, surrounded by the wives of prominent townsmen, her posture rigid and unwelcoming. Jake seemed to sense Clara's trepidation. "Would you allow me to escort you home, Miss Evans?" he asked, offering his arm. Clara hesitated. The gesture would be noticed by everyone, including her mother. It would signal a connection between them that went beyond fellow boarders. Yet the alternative, walking past her mother alone, vulnerable to whatever cutting remark Vivian might make, was worse. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she said, placing her hand on his arm. They walked down the church steps and into the yard, following the path that would necessarily take them past where Vivian stood. Clara felt her mother's gaze before she saw it cold, assessing, disapproving. "Clara," Vivian said as they approached, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest her. "I see you found employment as a maid. How fitting." Clara felt the sting of the words but kept her expression neutral. "Good morning, Mother. It's a lovely day for worship, isn't it?" Vivian's lips thinned. Her gaze shifted to Jake, taking in his quality clothing and confident bearing. "And who is your friend?" Jake stepped forward slightly, a subtle but clear protective gesture. "Jake Anderson, madam. I own the Double J Ranch north of here." Recognition flickered in Vivian's eyes. Even she would have heard of the successful cattle operation Jake had built. "I see. And how do you come to be acquainted with my daughter?" "We're both staying at Mrs. Winters's boarding house," Jake replied evenly. "Miss Evans has become indispensable there. Mrs. Winters speaks very highly of her abilities." Vivian's expression hardened. "Does she indeed?" "Well, Mr. Anderson, I feel obliged to warn you that my daughter has proven disappointing in the most fundamental duty of womanhood. 5 years of marriage and not a single child to show for it. Such barrenness is a cruel blow to any man hoping for a family." Clara felt as if she'd been slapped. Even knowing her mother's bitterness, she hadn't expected such a public denouncement. Several nearby conversations faltered as people turned to listen. Jake's arm tensed beneath Clara's hand, but his voice remained steady. "With all due respect, Mrs. Evans, I believe a woman's worth extends far beyond her ability to bear children. Your daughter has shown remarkable courage and dignity in the face of significant hardship. Those qualities speak more to her character than any circumstance beyond her control." Vivian's face flushed with anger. "You speak of matters you cannot understand, Mr. Anderson. A woman's primary purpose is whatever she determines it to be," Jake interrupted firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I promise to see Miss Evans safely home." Without waiting for a response, Jake guided Clara away from her mother and through the churchyard. Clara walked beside him in stunned silence, barely noticing the whispers that followed them or the curious glances from townspeople who had witnessed the exchange. It wasn't until they were several blocks from the church that Clara found her voice. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "My mother is influential in Willowcreek. She could make trouble for your business dealings." Jake slowed his pace, looking down at her with a mixture of concern and determination. Some things are more important than business, Clara. No one deserves to be humiliated like that, especially not by their own mother. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. Thank you for your kindness, but please don't feel obligated to champion my cause. I've accepted my situation. Jake stopped walking altogether, turning to face her directly. Have you accepted that your value is somehow diminished because you haven't borne children? Because I don't believe that for a moment. And I don't think you should either. His vehemence surprised her. My mother raised me to believe that a woman's greatest achievement is motherhood. When my husband died without my having given him a son or any child, it was the final proof of my failure. Jake shook his head, his expression pained. Clara, listen to me. I've known women who couldn't have children and women who chose not to. I've known mothers who abandoned their young and childless women who nurtured everyone around them. It's not the ability to bear a child that makes someone worthy of respect. It's what they bring to the lives of others. His words touched something deep within Clara, a wounded place that had been festering since her mother's rejection. I want to believe that, she whispered. Then start by believing in yourself, Jake said gently. The Clara Evans I've come to know in these past weeks is kind, hardworking, and intelligent. She makes everyone at the boarding house feel welcome and valued. Those qualities matter far more than whether or not you can have children. Clara blinked back tears, overwhelmed by his perception and the conviction in his voice. Thank you, she said simply, unable to express the fullness of her gratitude. They resumed their walk back to the boarding house in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the front porch, Jake hesitated. I'm riding out to my ranch tomorrow, he said. There are matters that need my attention, but I'll be returning to Willowcreek in a week or so to finalize my business with the bank. Clara felt a surprising pang of disappointment at the news of his departure. I hope your business goes well, she said politely. Jake studied her face for a moment. Clara, would you consider visiting the Double J someday? Mrs. Winters could spare you for an afternoon, I'm sure. I'd like to show you what I've built. The invitation was unexpected and somewhat unconventional. An unmarried woman visiting a bachelor's ranch would certainly raise eyebrows in Willowcreek. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Clara said hesitantly. Jake smiled. I was thinking you could come with Mrs. Winters when she's feeling better. I've invited her several times, but she always claims to be too busy. Perhaps with your encouragement, she'd finally accept. Clara returned his smile, relieved and slightly disappointed at the clarification. I'll speak with her about it when you return. Jake nodded, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. Until then, Miss Evans. The week following Jake's departure seemed to drag endlessly. Clara threw herself into her work at the boarding house, taking on extra tasks to fill the hours and to repay Mrs. Winters for her kindness. She avoided going into town as much as possible, unwilling to risk another encounter with her mother or to face the gossip that had surely sprung from their church confrontation. On Wednesday afternoon, as Clara was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house, Mrs. Winters approached with a letter in hand. This came for you, dear, she said, holding out the envelope. Ryder brought it from the Double J Ranch. Clara took the letter with surprise, her heart quickening at the sight of her name written in a bold masculine hand. She waited until Mrs. Winters had returned inside before opening it. Dear Miss Evans, I hope this letter finds you well and that Mrs. Winters has recovered from her cold. My business at the ranch is proceeding faster than anticipated, and I find myself with an unexpected opportunity that I would like to share with you. The bank in Willowcreek has agreed to finance my purchase of additional grazing land, but they require proper documentation of my current holdings and operations. In short, they need my accounts and correspondence organized in a manner more befitting a successful business than my current haphazard system allows. During our conversations, you mentioned your excellent penmanship and education, and I have observed your skill in managing Mrs. Winters's account books. I would like to offer you a position as my ranch secretary and business correspondent. The salary would be $25 per month, with room and board provided at the main house, which has separate quarters for staff that would ensure propriety. This is not charity, Miss Evans, but a genuine business need. My foreman's wife, Mrs. Mitchell, serves as housekeeper and would welcome female company, as would the other women at the ranch. Willowcreek is only a half-day's ride away, allowing for visits should you wish to maintain your connections there. I understand this is an unconventional proposal, and I assure you that my intentions are strictly professional. You have impressed me with your intelligence and character, and I believe you could bring valuable skills to my growing enterprise. I will return to Willow Creek on Monday next and would be happy to discuss this opportunity further at that time. Please consider it seriously, as I believe it could be beneficial for us both. Respectfully yours, Jake Anderson. Clara read the letter twice, her mind racing with the possibilities it presented. The salary Jake offered was generous, far more than she earned helping Mrs. Winters, and with room and board included. The work would suit her abilities better than housekeeping, and the chance to start fresh away from her mother's influence and the town's gossip was appealing. Yet she couldn't help wondering about Jake's true motives. Was this genuinely a business proposition, or was he offering her charity disguised as employment? And what would people say about her living at a bachelor's ranch, regardless of the presence of other women? Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, deciding to sleep on the decision before sharing it with Mrs. Winters. She needed time to sort through her tangled feelings: gratitude for the opportunity, wariness about potential gossip, and a flutter of something else when she thought about seeing Jake again. That evening, as Clara was helping to serve dinner to the boarders, the front door burst open to admit a red-faced young man Clara recognized as one of the bank clerk's assistants. "Fire!" he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Fire at the Evans place! Everyone come quick!" The dining room erupted into chaos as men pushed back from the table and rushed for the door. Clara stood frozen, the serving platter in her hand suddenly heavy as lead. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Winters said, gently taking the platter from her. "Go. Whatever has happened between you and your mother, you need to see for yourself." Clara nodded numbly and followed the crowd streaming toward the north end of town where the Evans house stood. Even from several blocks away, she could see the orange glow of flames against the darkening sky and smell the acrid scent of burning wood. By the time she reached the house, the volunteer fire brigade was already at work, pumping water from the street cistern and passing buckets hand to hand. The flames had engulfed the back of the house where the kitchen was located, and thick black smoke billowed from the upstairs windows. "Mother!" Clara cried, pushing through the onlookers. "Has anyone seen my mother?" The fire chief, his face streaked with soot, shook his head grimly. "We're told she was inside when it started, madam. No one's come out." Horror washed over Clara. Whatever their differences, Vivian was still her mother. "We have to find her." "Miss, we can't let anyone in there," the chief said firmly, holding her back as she moved toward the house. "The roof could collapse any minute." As if in confirmation of his words, there was a tremendous cracking sound, and a section of the second floor caved in, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Clara covered her mouth to stifle a sob, watching helplessly as her childhood home and possibly her only remaining family was consumed by the relentless flames. For hours, Clara stood with the other townspeople as the fire brigade fought to contain the blaze and prevent it from spreading to neighboring houses. By midnight, the Evans house was nothing but a smoldering shell, the elegant facade now a blackened skeleton against the star-filled Wyoming sky. The fire chief approached Clara, his expression solemn. "Miss Evans, I'm sorry. We've found remains in what was your mother's bedroom. The doctor confirms it's a woman." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Despite their estrangement, despite the harsh words and cruel judgment, Vivian had been her mother. The reality of her death was a physical pain in Clara's chest, a grief complicated by the unresolved tension between them. Mrs. Winters appeared at Clara's side, wrapping a supportive arm around her waist. "Come back to the boarding house now, dear. There's nothing more to be done tonight. Tomorrow will be time enough for decisions." Numb with shock and exhaustion, Clara allowed herself to be led away from the ruins of her former home. The night passed in a blur of fitful sleep and waking nightmares, images of flames and falling timbers merging with memories of her mother in happier times, before bitterness and disappointment had hardened Vivian's heart. Morning brought the practical concerns that follow tragedy. As Vivian's only child, Clara was responsible for the funeral arrangements and for dealing with whatever remained of her mother's estate. The town lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, sent a message requesting her presence at his office as soon as possible. "Miss Evans," Mr. Pemberton said gravely when Clara entered his cluttered office, "please accept my condolences on your loss. Your mother was a formidable woman and will be missed in Willowcreek." Clara nodded, too drained to speak. She sat in the offered chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I must inform you that your mother came to see me 3 weeks ago," Pemberton continued, extracting a document from a folder. "She updated her will after your departure from her home." Clara tensed, anticipating further rejection even from beyond the grave. "The substance of the will is straightforward," Pemberton said, adjusting his spectacles. "Your mother has left the entirety of her estate to the church building fund, with the exception of her personal jewelry, which she specified should go to you." Clara received this news with a curious detachment. She had expected nothing from her mother, so the bequest of the jewelry pieces that had been in the Evans family for generations was actually more than she had hoped for. "However," Pemberton added, "the circumstances have changed significantly since your mother drafted this will. The house and most of its contents have been destroyed. The land remains, of course, and there are bank accounts and investments that are unaffected by the fire. The total value is considerable." "And all of it goes to the church?" Clara asked, her voice hollow. Pemberton hesitated. "That was your mother's intention. However, there is a legal complication. The will specifies the house at 412 Maple Street and all its contents. Since the house no longer exists as such, there is an argument to be made that this portion of the bequest has failed." Clara frowned. "I don't understand." "In simpler terms, Miss Evans, a case could be made that you, as the only heir at law, should inherit the land and the value of the house through intestate succession, with only the bank accounts and investments going to the church." Clara considered this information. The land in town was valuable, and even with the house gone, it represented a significant asset. With it, she could build a new life for herself in Willowcreek if she chose. Yet the thought of fighting with the church over her mother's estate left a sour taste in her mouth. And did she truly want to rebuild in the shadow of her mother's disapproval? "Mr. Pemberton, I have no desire to contest my mother's will," she said finally. "Let the church have what she intended for it. I would ask only for the jewelry, as specified, and perhaps a fair price for the land if the church wishes to sell it for development." Pemberton looked surprised. "That's very generous, Miss Evans. Are you certain?" Clara nodded. "I am. Please make whatever arrangements are necessary." As she left the lawyer's office, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had made her decision not out of fear or obligation, but from a place of self-determination. For perhaps the first time in her life, she was charting her own course rather than following the path laid out by others. The funeral was held 2 days later, a somber affair attended by most of Willowcreek's prominent citizens. Clara sat alone in the front pew, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. Many expressed surprise at her presence, given the public nature of her estrangement from Vivian, but Clara knew that attending was the right thing to do, both for her mother's memory and for her own peace of mind. As the service concluded and the mourners dispersed, Clara remained seated, gazing at the simple casket. So much had been left unsaid between them, so many opportunities for reconciliation lost to pride and hurt feelings. Miss Evans. The familiar voice drew Clara from her thoughts. She turned to find Jake Anderson standing in the aisle, hat in hand, his expression one of sincere sympathy. "Mr. Anderson," she said, rising to her feet. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I came as soon as I heard," he replied. "I'm so sorry, Clara. Despite your differences, I know this must be incredibly difficult for you." His use of her given name felt natural, a comfort rather than an impropriety in the emptiness of the church. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "How are you holding up?" he asked, genuine concern in his blue eyes. Clara considered the question honestly. "I'm grieving, but not just for my mother as she was at the end. I'm grieving for the relationship we might have had if things had been different." Jake nodded, understanding. "That's a particular kind of sorrow, mourning what might have been." They walked together out of the church and into the autumn sunshine. The cemetery was adjacent to the churchyard, and Clara could see the gravediggers already at work preparing the final resting place for Vivian Evans. "I received your letter," Clara said after a moment of silence. "And?" Jake prompted gently. "I was considering your offer even before the fire," she admitted. "Now, with everything that's happened, I find myself at a crossroads. There's nothing keeping me in Willowcreek anymore." Jake studied her face. "The offer stands, Clara. In fact, I believe you'd be even more valuable to the ranch operation than I initially thought. But I want you to be sure it's what you want, not just an escape from painful memories." Clara appreciated his candor. "I need some time to settle my mother's affairs and to think clearly about the future. Could I give you my answer in a few days?" "Of course," Jake said. "I'll be in town until Friday, attending to my business at the bank. Take all the time you need." They parted ways at the church gate. Jake to his meetings and Clara to the grim task of watching her mother laid to rest. As she stood by the graveside, listening to the minister's final prayers, Clara felt a sense of closure beginning to form within her heart. The complicated relationship with her mother would always be a part of her story, but it didn't have to define her future. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as Clara worked with Mr. Pemberton to execute her mother's will and made arrangements for the jewelry to be retrieved from the bank vault where Vivian had stored it for safekeeping. The church board accepted Clara's proposal regarding the land with gratitude, agreeing to pay her a fair market value if they decided to sell it rather than build upon it. By Thursday evening, most of the immediate business had been concluded, and Clara found herself at a true turning point. Mrs. Winters had assured her that her position at the boarding house was secure if she wished to stay, but Jake's offer remained a tantalizing alternative. After dinner, Clara walked to the small garden behind the boarding house, seeking solitude to organize her thoughts. The evening was cool, with a light breeze carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. She sat on a wooden bench, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "May I join you?" Jake's voice came from behind her. Clara turned, surprised but not displeased by his presence. "Of course." He settled beside her on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a while they sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of Willowcreek distant piano music from the saloon, the occasional whinny of a horse, the low murmur of conversation from the boarding house's open windows. "I've been thinking about your offer," Clara said finally. Jake nodded but didn't press her, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "When I was a child," Clara said, "my father would take me riding on his land. He'd point to the mountains and tell me that beyond them lay endless possibilities, that a person could reinvent themselves in the West if they had the courage to try." She smiled at the memory. "I used to dream of having that kind of courage." "You've shown remarkable courage these past months," Jake observed. "Not everyone could have endured what you have with such grace." Clara glanced at him, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth," Jake insisted. "You've faced public humiliation, the loss of your home and status, and now your mother's death. Yet here you are, still standing, still making thoughtful decisions about your future rather than giving in to despair." His words warmed something within Clara, a recognition of her own strength that she had rarely acknowledged. "I've decided to accept your offer, Mr. Anderson." Jake's expression brightened. "I'm pleased to hear it." "But I have conditions," Clara added firmly. "I'm listening." "First, I want it clear to everyone at the ranch and in town that this is a professional arrangement. I won't have people thinking I've become your companion." Jake nodded seriously. "Absolutely. I've already explained the nature of the position to my foreman and his wife. They understand completely. Second, I want a written agreement outlining my duties and compensation, something I can show to anyone who questions the propriety of the arrangement." "I'll have Mr. Pemberton draw it up tomorrow," Jake agreed. "And finally," Clara continued, "I want the freedom to leave if the position doesn't suit me, with a month's salary as severance to allow me time to make new arrangements." Jake considered this last condition. "That seems fair, though I hope it won't be necessary. Is there anything else?" Clara shook her head. "No, those are my terms." "Then we have an agreement," Jake said, extending his hand to her. Clara hesitated only briefly before taking it, noting the calluses that spoke of his years of hard work building his ranch. His grip was firm but gentle. A handshake between equals rather than a man indulging a woman's business pretensions. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. "I'm returning to the Double J on Saturday morning," Jake replied. "If you can be ready by then, you could travel with me. The journey's easier with company, and I can show you the land as we ride." Clara nodded, already mentally cataloging the preparations she would need to make. "I'll be ready." Saturday dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day for traveling. Clara had said her goodbyes to Mrs. Winters and the other boarders the night before, promising to write and to visit when she could. Her trunk was packed with the few belongings she had salvaged from her life before, plus several practical items Mrs. Winters had insisted she take as a parting gift. Jake arrived at the boarding house promptly at 8, driving a light wagon rather than riding his usual mount. "I thought this would be more comfortable for you," he explained as he loaded her trunk into the back. "And it allows us to bring more of your things." Clara appreciated the thoughtfulness. While she had ridden horses all her life, the prospect of a half-day's journey in a side saddle was not appealing, especially with the emotional weight of leaving Willowcreek behind. As they drove through town, Clara gazed at the familiar buildings and faces with a mixture of nostalgia and relief. Willowcreek had been her home for her entire life, the setting for her happiest memories and her deepest sorrows. Yet now, watching it recede as the wagon headed north, she felt not loss but anticipation. "Having second thoughts?" Jake asked, noticing her backward glance. "No," Clara replied honestly, "just saying goodbye to one chapter before beginning another." The journey to the Double J Ranch took them through rolling grasslands dotted with stands of aspen and pine. As they traveled, Jake pointed out landmarks and boundaries, explaining how he had gradually expanded his holdings from an initial 160 acres to nearly 2,000. "It was rough going at first," he admitted. "Wyoming winters can be brutal, and cattle ranching is a risky business. I lost almost half my herd in the blizzard of '68. "What kept you going?" Clara asked, genuinely curious about the determination that had built this man. Jake considered the question. "Stubbornness, mostly," he said with a self-deprecating smile, "and the knowledge that I was building something that would last beyond me. A legacy, I suppose." Clara understood the desire for legacy. It was what had driven her mother's obsession with grandchildren, after all the continuation of the Evans name and bloodline. Yet Jake had found another way to leave his mark on the world. "There it is," Jake said as they crested a ridge around midday. The Double J. Below them stretched a verdant valley bisected by a ribbon of silver, a creek that meandered through pasture land where cattle grazed in contentment. Near the creek stood a cluster of buildings, a large two-story house built of sturdy logs, several barns and outbuildings, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, a welcome sight after the long journey. "It's beautiful," Clara said sincerely, taking in the peaceful scene. Jake's expression was one of quiet pride. "It's taken years of hard work, but yes, I think it's turning into something special." As they approached the ranch yard, a woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and a weathered face that broke into a warm smile at the sight of the wagon. "About time you got back, boss," she called. "Supper's nearly ready, and Frank's been fussing about those contracts from the cattle buyer." Jake chuckled. "Clara, this is Martha Mitchell, the backbone of the Double J and wife of my foreman, Frank. Martha, this is Miss Clara Evans, our new ranch secretary." Martha approached the wagon, her shrewd eyes assessing Clara with friendly interest. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Evans. It'll be nice having another woman around the place. The men outnumber us something fierce." Clara smiled, immediately warming to Martha's straightforward manner. "I'm happy to be here, Mrs. Mitchell. And please, call me Clara." "Only if you call me Martha," the older woman replied. "We don't stand on ceremony much out here." With Jake's help, Clara descended from the wagon, stretching her legs after the long ride. Several ranch hands had appeared from the barns and bunkhouse, curious about the new arrival. Jake introduced them briefly, their names and faces blurring together in Clara's tired mind. "I'll show you to your quarters," Martha said, gesturing toward the main house. "The boss had us fix up the rooms at the east end of the house. You'll have your own entrance and a sitting room besides your bedroom." The arrangement was exactly as Jake had described in his letter, professional and proper, with due consideration for Clara's reputation. She followed Martha into the house, noting the solid construction and comfortable, if plain, furnishings. The eastern wing was separated from the main living areas by a short hallway with a door that could be closed for privacy. Clara's quarters consisted of a small sitting room with a writing desk and bookshelves, a bedroom with a four-poster bed and wardrobe, and a tiny washing room with a copper tub and pitcher. "It's lovely," Clara said, genuinely pleased with the accommodations. "The boss had the men bring in that desk special from Cheyenne," Martha confided. "Said you'd need a proper place to work when you weren't using the office in the barn." Clara ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the desk, touched by Jake's attention to detail. It was a fine piece, with multiple drawers and a leather writing surface. "It's perfect for correspondence." "Supper's at 6, Martha informed her. "The men eat earlier, but the boss takes his meals later, and you're welcome to join him. Otherwise, I can bring a tray to your rooms if you prefer." "I'll join Mr. Anderson for dinner," Clara decided. "But first, I'd like to freshen up from the journey." Left alone in her new quarters, Clara unpacked her few belongings, arranging her mother's jewelry in the small wooden box she'd brought for the purpose. The pieces seemed out of place in these simple surroundings, diamonds and pearls that had been worn to grand social occasions in Willowcreek, now residing in a ranch house miles from town. Yet as Clara washed away the dust of travel and changed into a clean dress, she felt a sense of rightness about her decision. The Double J might be far from the life she had known, but perhaps here, away from the weight of expectations and past disappointments, she could finally discover who Clara Evans truly was. Dinner that evening was a simple but hearty affair: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread, with apple pie for dessert. Jake proved to be an attentive host, drawing Clara out about her interests and sharing stories of the ranch's early days. "Tomorrow I'll show you the office and the books," he said as they lingered over coffee. I'm afraid you'll find them in a sorry state. My talents lie more in working cattle than in keeping records. Clara smiled. I look forward to bringing some order to them. When I was helping Mrs. Winters with her accounts, I discovered I have quite a knack for organization. That's exactly what the Double J needs, Jake said. We've grown too quickly for our old systems to keep up. The bank wants detailed records for the loan, and the cattle buyers expect proper bills of sale. It's become too much for me to handle alongside managing the ranch operations. I'll do my best to establish a system that works for everyone, Clara promised. The following days saw Clara settling into a rhythm at the Double J. Mornings were spent in the ranch office, a small room attached to the main barn, where she tackled the disorganized ledgers and correspondence with methodical determination. Afternoons often found her writing letters to cattle buyers or suppliers, using her education and refined penmanship to present the Double J as a professional operation. Jake was true to his word about the position being genuine work rather than charity. He expected results and wasn't shy about asking for changes when her initial systems didn't quite meet the ranch's needs. Yet he was also quick to acknowledge her successes and to value her input on business matters. As autumn deepened toward winter, Clara found herself increasingly involved in the life of the ranch. She joined Martha in putting up preserves for the cold months ahead, learned to bake the hearty bread the ranch hands favored, and even began riding again, accompanying Jake on occasional inspections of the property. It was during one such ride in late November that Clara truly began to understand Jake's passion for the land. They had ridden to the northern boundary of the ranch, where a ridge overlooked miles of grassland stretching toward distant mountains. When I first saw this valley, Jake said, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air, I knew this was where I wanted to build my life. It reminded me of something my father used to say, that a man's true wealth is measured not in gold, but in the legacy he creates. Clara nodded, understanding the sentiment. My father felt the same way about our family name. He believed it would endure through his descendants. She smiled sadly. I'm afraid I've disappointed him in that regard. Jake turned in his saddle to look at her directly. Do you regret not having children? The question was personal, but in the months they had worked together, a friendship had developed that allowed for such directness. I used to, Clara admitted. When I was first married, I prayed every night for a child. As the years passed and my prayers went unanswered, I began to wonder if there was something wrong with me. And now? Jake prompted gently. Clara considered the question, watching an eagle soar on the thermals above the valley. Now I think perhaps God had a different path in mind for me. Not everyone is meant to be a parent. Jake nodded thoughtfully. My sister Sarah couldn't have children. She and her husband adopted 3 orphans from the war and raised them as their own. They're fine adults now, with families of their own. Sarah's legacy isn't in her bloodline, but in the lives she's touched. His words resonated with Clara, offering a perspective she had never fully considered. That's a beautiful way to think about it. As winter settled over the Double J, the ranch routine changed to accommodate the harsh Wyoming weather. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures closer to the barns, and the ranch hands worked tirelessly to ensure adequate feed and protection for the valuable herd. Clara's work shifted as well, with fewer letters to write during the slow season, but more time spent updating the ranch ledgers and planning for spring purchases. The Christmas season brought a festive atmosphere to the ranch, with Martha organizing a celebration for the ranch hands and their families. Clara helped decorate the main house with pine boughs and ribbon, and spent evenings baking cookies and fruitcakes from her mother's recipes. On Christmas Eve, as a snowstorm howled outside, the residents of the Double J gathered in the main house for dinner and gift exchange. The long table in the dining room was crowded with ranch hands, their wives and children, creating a boisterous but joyful atmosphere that was entirely different from the formal Christmas celebrations of Clara's past. Jake had insisted that Clara join them at the main table rather than eating separately, and she found herself seated beside him at the head of the gathering. The meal was abundant roast goose, venison, and all the trimmings, and the conversation flowed as freely as the mulled wine Martha had prepared. After dinner, gifts were exchanged, practical items mostly, like new gloves or hand-knitted scarves, with special treats for the children. Clara had used some of her salary to purchase small tokens for Martha and the other ranch wives, and had spent weeks secretly embroidering handkerchiefs for the men, including a special one for Jake, with the Double J brand stitched in one corner. When it came time for Jake to present his gift to Clara, he handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It's not much," he said almost shyly, "but I thought you might like it." Clara unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a delicate pattern of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate design. "I noticed you writing in that small notebook sometimes in the evenings," Jake explained. "Thought you might like something more substantial for your thoughts." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Clara deeply. She had indeed been keeping a journal of her experiences at the Double J, finding that writing helped her process the significant changes in her life. That Jake had noticed this private habit and responded with such an appropriate gift spoke to his attentiveness. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's perfect." As the evening wore on and the ranch hands gradually departed for their own quarters, braving the snow to return to the bunkhouse or their family cabins, Clara helped Martha clear the table and wash the dishes. Jake built up the fire in the main room, and when the kitchen was finally tidy, the three of them sat before the hearth, enjoying a final cup of Christmas cheer. "This has been the loveliest Christmas I can remember," Clara admitted, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Martha smiled knowingly. "Having a proper family gathering makes all the difference, doesn't it? All those fancy parties can't compare to being with people who truly care about you." Clara considered the older woman's words. Was that what the Double J had become to her, a family? The thought was both comforting and slightly alarming. She had come here for employment, for a fresh start away from painful memories. She hadn't expected to find a sense of belonging. Martha excused herself soon after, claiming exhaustion from the day's festivities and leaving Clara and Jake alone by the fire. For a time they sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind howling outside and the occasional pop from the burning logs. "I want to thank you," Clara said finally. "Not just for the journal, but for everything these past months. You've given me more than employment, Jake. You've given me a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms." Jake's expression was warm in the firelight. "You've earned your place here, Clara. The ranch runs more smoothly than ever since you took over the books and correspondence. The bank was impressed with our loan application, said it was the most professional they'd seen from a ranch operation." Clara smiled at the praise but shook her head slightly. "It's more than that, though. You saw value in me when others, including my own mother, saw only failure. You offered me dignity when I needed it most." Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I meant what I said that day outside the church, Clara. A woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to bear children. It's in her character, her intelligence, her kindness." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "You have all those qualities in abundance." Something in his tone made Clara's heart beat faster. The firelight cast shadows across his strong features, highlighting the sincerity in his eyes. "Jake." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, breaking the moment. Jake stood, moving to check that the shutters were secure against the storm. When he returned to his seat, the conversation shifted to more practical matters, concerns about the cattle in the storm, plans for the spring breeding program, the new fencing needed for the expanded grazing land. Yet as Clara retired to her rooms that night, journal clutched to her chest, she couldn't help but wonder about what had remained unspoken between them in that moment by the fire. January brought the bitter cold that Wyoming was famous for, with temperatures dropping well below zero and snow piling in drifts against the ranch buildings. The work of the ranch continued despite the weather. Cattle still needed feeding, fences required repair, and the business of planning for spring went on. Clara found herself increasingly involved in decisions about the ranch's future. Jake sought her opinion on potential land purchases, consulted her about cattle prices, and trusted her to negotiate with suppliers. Their working relationship had evolved into a partnership of sorts, each respecting the other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. On a particularly frigid morning in late January, Clara was working in the ranch office when Jake burst in, his face grim beneath his frost-covered hat. "We've got trouble," he said, without preamble. "Frank and the boys found a dozen head dead in the north pasture. Looks like rustlers hit during the night, took what they could drive, and shot the rest out of spite." Clara set down her pen, alarmed by the news. Cattle rustling was a serious threat to any ranch operation, representing not just the immediate loss of valuable stock, but also a challenge to the ranch's security. "How many did they take?" "Frank estimates 30 head," Jake replied, pacing the small office. "Young steers, mostly, ready for spring market. It's a substantial loss." "Have you sent word to the sheriff?" Clara asked, already calculating the financial impact. Jake nodded. "Ryder left an hour ago. But we're 20 miles from town, and the sheriff has a large territory. By the time he gets here, the trail will be cold, especially with this snow." Clara rose from her desk, moving to the map of the ranch territory that hung on the wall. "Where exactly did this happen?" Jake pointed to an area near the northern boundary. "Here, where Elkhorn Creek runs into the valley. It's one of our more remote pastures." Clara studied the map, noting the proximity to public land beyond the ranch boundaries. "They would have driven them north then, into the hills?" "That would be my guess," Jake agreed. "There are old mining trails up there where they could hide the herd before moving them to market somewhere far from here." Clara turned to face him, seeing the tension in his jaw and the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "What will you do?" "Frank's organizing a tracking party," Jake said. "We'll follow their trail as far as we can. If we're lucky, we might catch up to them before they reach the territorial line." Alarm flashed through Clara. "That sounds dangerous. These men have already shown they're willing to kill livestock. They might not hesitate to shoot a rancher protecting his property." "It's a risk we have to take," Jake said firmly. "If we let rustlers operate with impunity, we might as well hand over the whole herd. Word gets around in these parts." Clara knew he was right, but the thought of Jake riding into danger made her stomach knot with fear. In the months she had been at the Double J, he had become more than an employer, more than a friend even. Though neither had spoken of deeper feelings, Clara could no longer deny, at least to herself, that her heart had found its home with this principled, hard-working man. "When do you leave?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Within the hour," Jake replied. "We need to move quickly if we have any hope of catching them." Clara nodded, her mind already shifting to practical matters. "I'll have Martha prepare food for you to take." "How many men are going?" "5, including me and Frank," Jake said, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at Clara's calm efficiency. "We'll likely be gone overnight, maybe longer if the trail leads far." "I'll manage things here," Clara assured him. "Just—" She hesitated, then continued softly. "Be careful, Jake. The Double J needs you. I need you," she added silently. Something in Jake's expression softened as he looked at her. "I will," he promised. Then, in a gesture that seemed almost unconscious, he reached out and squeezed her hand briefly before turning to leave. The next 36 hours were among the most anxious of Clara's life. She threw herself into ranch business to distract from her worries, reviewing contracts, updating ledgers, and helping Martha prepare for the men's return. The ranch hands who remained behind kept up the essential work of feeding and checking on the cattle, their faces grim with the knowledge that their comrades were pursuing dangerous men. It was late afternoon of the second day when a ranch hand burst into the main house, breathless from running. "They're back," he announced to Clara and Martha, who were mending shirts in the living room. "Mr. Anderson and the others, they're coming down the north road." Clara was on her feet instantly, moving to the window to peer through the gathering dusk. Sure enough, a line of riders was approaching the ranch yard, moving slowly through the snow. She counted quickly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There was an extra rider, bound to his saddle from the look of it. She grabbed her shawl and hurried outside, Martha close behind her. As the riders drew nearer, Clara could make out Jake at the lead, his familiar figure a welcome sight that made her heart leap. But her relief quickly turned to alarm as she noticed he was slumped slightly in the saddle, one arm held tight against his body. "Jake!" she called, hurrying across the yard as the riders entered the ranch gate. He looked up at the sound of her voice, his face pale beneath several days' growth of beard. "Clara," he said, his voice strained but steady. "We got them. 3 rustlers, and we recovered most of the cattle." "You're hurt," Clara said, reaching up toward him as he reined his horse to a stop. Jake grimaced. "It's nothing serious. Bullet grazed my side during the scuffle." He dismounted carefully, wincing as his boots hit the ground. Clara was at his side instantly, slipping her arm around his waist to support him. "Martha, have the men prepare the spare bedroom in the main house," she directed, "and send someone for the doctor." "No need for the doctor," Jake protested. "Just need cleaning and bandaging. Frank already did what he could on the trail." Clara ignored his objections, guiding him toward the house as the other men took charge of the bound rustler and began caring for the tired horses. She could feel the warmth of blood seeping through Jake's coat where her hand rested against his side. In the spare bedroom, Clara helped Jake remove his coat and shirt, revealing a makeshift bandage soaked with blood. She unwrapped it carefully, exposing a deep furrow across his ribs where the bullet had torn through flesh without penetrating deeply. "You were lucky," she said softly, examining the wound. "An inch to the left, and it might have been fatal." Jake watched her face as she worked, his expression difficult to read. "We all face risks out here. It's part of the life." Clara dampened a cloth and began cleaning the wound, her touch gentle despite the anger and fear churning within her. "That doesn't make it easier for those waiting at home," she said, focusing on her task rather than meeting his eyes. Jake caught her wrist, stilling her movements. "Clara," he said, his voice low and intense. "Look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly, afraid of what her expression might reveal. "I came back," he said simply. "I'll always come back." The promise in those words hung between them, weighted with meaning that transcended their professional relationship. Clara's breath caught in her throat as Jake's hand moved from her wrist to cup her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her jawline. "Jake," she whispered, his name both a question and an answer. "I've been wanting to say this for months," he began, his eyes never leaving hers. "You came here as my employee, and I've tried to maintain proper boundaries. But Clara, you've become so much more than that to me. You've become essential to the ranch, yes, but more importantly, to my happiness." Clara felt tears welling in her eyes, tears of relief and joy and lingering fear for what might have happened on that snow-covered trail. "I thought I was the only one feeling this way," she admitted. Jake smiled, though the movement caused him to wince slightly. "Far from it. I think even the ranch hands have been taking bets on when I'd finally speak up." A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Martha entered with a tray of medical supplies, her experienced eye taking in the scene and the unfinished bandaging. "I'll take over from here, Miss Clara," she said firmly. You look like you could use a moment to collect yourself. Clara nodded gratefully, reluctantly moving away from Jake. I'll check on the men, make sure they have food and hot coffee, she said, needing a practical task to ground herself after the emotional exchange. Jake caught her hand as she turned to leave. We'll finish this conversation later, he said, his tone making it clear that he had more to say. The evening passed in a flurry of activity as the ranch adjusted to the return of the tracking party and dealt with the captured rustler, who was locked in a storeroom until he could be transferred to the sheriff's custody. Clara moved through it all in a state of heightened awareness, attending to necessary tasks while her mind replayed Jake's words and the tenderness in his touch. It was well after midnight when the ranch finally settled into silence. Clara sat in her sitting room, unable to sleep, the new journal open on her lap though she had written nothing. A soft knock at her door brought her to her feet, her heart racing. Jake stood in the hallway, dressed in clean clothes, his side properly bandaged. He looked tired but determined. May I come in? I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep without speaking to you. Clara nodded, stepping back to admit him. Propriety dictated that she should keep the door open for such a late visit, but she closed it softly behind him, acknowledging that what needed to be said between them was private. Jake remained standing, his posture slightly stiff due to his injury. I meant what I said earlier, Clara. These past months with you at the Double J have shown me what's been missing in my life. I built this ranch thinking the land and the cattle were enough of a legacy, but I was wrong. Clara watched him, hardly daring to breathe as he continued. When I was out there tracking those rustlers, cold and hurting, all I could think about was getting back to you, Jake said, his voice roughening with emotion. Not to the ranch, not to the buildings or the land or the cattle. To you, because you've become my home, Clara. Tears spilled onto Clara's cheeks at his words. Oh, Jake, she whispered. He crossed the room to her in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. I know this might seem sudden, though God knows I've felt this way for months, but life out here is uncertain today proved that. I don't want to waste any more time pretending we're just employer and employee when we both know it's so much more. Clara squeezed his hands, her heart too full for words. I love you, Clara Evans, Jake said simply. I love your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. I love how you've made this ranch better through your work. I love how you've made me better through your friendship. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that gleamed in the lamplight, a ring, a simple gold band set with a single modest diamond. This was my mother's, he explained. She told me to give it to the woman who became my true partner in life. Clara's eyes widened as Jake slowly, carefully, lowered himself to one knee despite his injury. I'm not asking you because I think a woman needs a husband to be complete, he said earnestly. You've proven your independence and capability beyond any doubt. I'm asking because I need you, Clara. Because I want to build a life with you, whatever that life may hold. He held up the ring. Clara Evans, will you marry me? Clara looked down at this man who had offered her respect when others gave her pity, who had seen value in her when her own mother had declared her worthless, who had given her a chance to rebuild her life with dignity and purpose. The answer was as clear as the Wyoming sky on a summer day. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. Yes, Jake Anderson, I will marry you. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to his feet, pulling her gently into his arms. Their first kiss was tender, a promise sealed with the touch of lips and the mingling of happy tears. When they parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers, a smile spreading across his face. I should go, he said reluctantly. Much as I'd like to stay, we should observe the proprieties at least until we've made our engagement official. Clara nodded, though she was reluctant to release him. When shall we announce it? How about at breakfast? Jake suggested. Martha has likely guessed already, and the men deserve some good news after the ordeal with the rustlers. Breakfast it is, Clara agreed, walking him to the door. Jake paused with his hand on the doorknob. One more thing, he said, his expression turning serious. I want you to know that I've never seen you as lacking in any way. Your mother was wrong, Clara. A woman's worth isn't measured by the children she bears. Clara felt a wave of emotion at his words, at the healing they brought to an old wound. Thank you for that, she said softly. Jake's eyes were steady on hers. When I said you've become my home, I meant it. You've given me something I never had before, a sense of belonging that goes beyond a place or a possession. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. She already gave me a home, he said simply. As Clara prepared for bed that night, her mother's ring on her finger catching the lamplight, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the rejection and public humiliation in Willowcreek to finding love and acceptance at the Double J, it had been a path of discovery and healing. Perhaps her mother had been right about one thing: Clara had indeed failed to fulfill the traditional expectations for a woman of her time. But in that failure she had found a different kind of fulfillment, one that honored her true self rather than conforming to others' definitions of womanhood. The ranch community received the news of their engagement with enthusiastic approval at breakfast the next morning. Martha claimed she had seen it coming for months, while Frank solemnly collected his winnings from the other ranch hands who had bet on a later announcement. Plans were made for a spring wedding to be held at the ranch once the weather improved enough for guests to travel from town. In the meantime, life at the Double J continued with its usual rhythms, though now Clara found herself looking at the land with new eyes, not as an employee, but as a future partner in both life and business. The winter months passed in a flurry of work and wedding preparations. Clara wrote to friends in Willowcreek, including Mrs. Winters, who promised to attend the ceremony. She also penned a letter to her cousin in Denver, her only remaining family, sharing her happiness and extending an invitation. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the pastures, Clara and Jake rode out one afternoon to a hillside overlooking the ranch. The valley stretched below them, vibrant with the promise of spring, the creek swollen with snowmelt, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. I was thinking, Jake said as they dismounted to rest the horses, about building a new house. Clara looked at him in surprise. What's wrong with the current one? Nothing, Jake admitted. It's sturdy and serviceable. But it was built when the ranch was just starting, before I knew what the Double J would become. He took her hand, running his thumb over the engagement ring. I'd like us to design our home together, something that reflects both our tastes and accommodates our future. Clara smiled, touched by his desire to include her in such a fundamental decision. I'd like that very much. Jake hesitated, his expression turning more serious. There's something else I've been meaning to discuss with you, about our future. Clara nodded encouragingly, sensing his slight nervousness. What is it? I know we can't be certain about having children of our own, he said carefully. And I want you to know that doesn't matter to me. You're enough, Clara, just as you are. Clara squeezed his hand, grateful for his reassurance. Thank you for saying that. But, Jake continued, I've been thinking about what I told you regarding my sister Sarah and her adopted children. He looked out over the valley, gathering his thoughts. There are so many children in need of homes, orphans from the war, from disease, from accidents in mining towns and homesteads. Clara's heart quickened as she began to understand where he was leading. If you're willing, Jake said, I thought perhaps we might consider opening our home to a child who needs one, not because we need children to complete our family, but because we have love to offer. Tears welled in Clara's eyes at the generosity of spirit behind his words. I think that's a beautiful idea, she said softly. In fact, I've been having similar thoughts. When I was organizing the ranch accounts last month, I came across your donations to the orphanage in Cheyenne. Jake looked surprised. You did? Clara nodded. It made me think about how fortunate we are, and how much we could offer a child without a family. She paused, gathering her courage to share a deeper hope. Perhaps even more than one, over time. Jake's face broke into a radiant smile. I'd like that, he said simply. To fill our home with love and laughter, to give children the stability and opportunities they might otherwise miss. Clara leaned against him, looking out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary and would now be her home in the fullest sense. My mother believed the only legacy worth having was through bloodlines, she said thoughtfully. But I think there are other ways to leave your mark on the world. Through the lives we touch, Jake agreed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. The hearts we open, the love we give freely, without conditions or expectations. Clara turned in his embrace, lifting her face to his. I love you, Jake Anderson, she said, her voice clear and certain. Not because you've rescued me or given me a place to belong, but because you've helped me find the strength that was always within me. Jake kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and shared dreams. When they parted, he looked into her eyes with a tenderness that made her heart swell. That's what real love does, he said softly. It doesn't create strength in someone else, it simply helps them discover what was already there. As they rode back to the ranch house side by side in the golden afternoon light, Clara felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with fulfilling societal expectations and everything to do with finding her true purpose. The path ahead would have its challenges, as all lives do, but she would face them with Jake beside her, their partnership forged in mutual respect and deepening love. The wedding took place in May, when the valley was carpeted with wildflowers and the cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf. Friends and neighbors gathered at the Double J, the ranch hands in their Sunday best, Mrs. Winters beaming with maternal pride as she watched Clara walk toward Jake in a simple but elegant white dress. Their vows were traditional in form, but deeply personal in meaning, each word spoken with the weight of their shared experiences and future hopes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests echoed across the valley, startling a flock of birds into flight against the clear blue sky. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food and dancing and stories shared around bonfires as darkness fell. When the last guest had departed or bedded down in the bunkhouse, Jake led Clara to their home, not to the main ranch house, but to a small cabin he and the men had secretly prepared at the edge of the property, a private retreat for their first days as husband and wife. Inside, Clara found fresh flowers on the table, a fire laid ready in the hearth, and a letter propped against a bottle of champagne. Jake watched with a smile as she opened it, recognizing the handwriting of her friend Mrs. Winters. My dear Clara, as you begin this new chapter of your life, I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you have become. When you first arrived at my boarding house, broken by circumstance but not in spirit, I saw in you a strength that would eventually triumph over adversity. You have found in Jake not a savior but a true partner, someone who recognizes your worth and celebrates your independence even as he offers his heart in partnership with yours. That kind of love is rare and precious. Your mother was wrong, my dear. A woman's value has never been in her ability to bear children, but in her capacity for love, her strength of character, and her courage in facing life's challenges. By those measures, you are among the richest women I know. May your marriage be blessed with joy, understanding, and mutual respect. And may you both find in each other the home your hearts have always sought. With love and best wishes, Eleanor Winters. Clara wiped away tears as she finished reading, passing the letter to Jake. She always did see more clearly than most, she said softly. Jake read the letter, then set it carefully aside before taking Clara in his arms. She's right, you know. About you being among the richest women, and about us finding our home in each other. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. When my mother cast me out, I thought I had lost everything. I never imagined that in losing what I thought I needed, I would find what I truly wanted. Jake tilted her face up to his. And what is that, Mrs. Anderson? He asked, using her new name for the first time. Clara smiled up at her husband, at this good man who had seen her worth when others couldn't, who had offered her not rescue, but partnership, not pity, but respect. A life of my own choosing, she said, work that matters, love that accepts me as I am, and a home built not of timber and nails, but of understanding and shared dreams. Jake's answering smile was tender as he lowered his lips to hers. Welcome home, Clara, he whispered against her mouth. Welcome home. In the years that followed, the Double J Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. The new house they built together became known throughout the territory for its warmth and hospitality, a gathering place for friends and travelers alike. True to their discussion on the hillside, Clara and Jake opened their home to children in need. First came a brother and sister, ages 8 and 6, orphaned when their parents' wagon train was caught in an early blizzard. Then a newborn left on the church steps in town, whom they named after Jake's father. Eventually, a teenage boy from the Cheyenne orphanage, skilled with horses and hungry for belonging. Each child brought new dimensions to their family, new challenges and joys that expanded their capacity for love. Clara discovered depths of maternal feeling she hadn't known she possessed, while Jake proved to be a patient and devoted father, teaching their children the value of hard work and the importance of integrity. When Clara turned 35, a miracle occurred that neither had expected or sought. She discovered she was with child. The pregnancy was difficult, her age and previous inability to conceive causing concern among the doctors they consulted. But in the spring of 1884, Clara gave birth to a healthy daughter whom they named Hope, a living symbol of the unexpected blessings life sometimes offers. Vivian Evans would have seen this biological child as validation, proof of Clara's worth as a woman, but Clara knew better. Hope was a cherished addition to their family, but she was no more beloved than the children who had come to them through other paths. Each one had brought unique gifts. Each had carved out a special place in Clara and Jake's hearts. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard, the oldest now a responsible young man helping with the ranch, the younger ones engaged in an elaborate game of their own invention. Jake reached for Clara's hand. "Are you happy?" he asked, the question simple but profound. Clara looked at their intertwined fingers, at the gold band that had symbolized their commitment for a decade now. Then she gazed out at the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the family, the business, the community of care they had created on this patch of Wyoming soil. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "My mother thought she was punishing me when she cast me out, but she actually set me free, free to find my own way, free to discover that a woman's worth isn't in her womb, but in her heart and mind and soul." Jake lifted her hand to his lips. "And free to give me the greatest gift of my life, a true home." Clara leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that they had found in each other exactly what they needed, not completion, for they had been whole individuals before they met, but complement. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone, a life defined not by society's expectations, but by their own vision of what mattered most. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Clara offered a silent thanks for the journey that had brought her here, for the pain that had led to growth. for the loss that had opened the way to finding, and for the love that had transformed a house into a home and strangers into family. In the end, her legacy would not be measured in bloodlines alone, but in lives touched, in love freely given, in a home open to all who needed one. And in that, Clara Evans Anderson had found a fulfillment far richer than anything her mother could have imagined for her.